Welcome to the latest episode of the Wellbeing Show. I'm talking to Sid, who's not far from where I'm going to be at the weekend. Just behind me, you'll see just beginning to pack all my camping gear because I'm off to climb Snowdon. And Sid's not far from that apparently, so you never know. If he's unlucky enough, I'll wheedle his address out of him and turn
Yeah.
and he'll have to deal with me, which is very different in person. Like at this sort of distance, it's fine. Sid is a really interesting story. I'm currently working with young people, very appropriate given that we've just had that extraordinary Netflix series Adolescence by Stephen and all his pals. So timely to talk about young people and how we can work with them. So when I saw his press release, I thought, boom, there we go. We want to get that going. Just remember, folks, it's a pre-recorded. So when you're watching it, me or Sid, I'm likely to be halfway up a mountain, and Sid might be doing something else like taking his kids to school or bringing them back. So don't phone us, but send me a text on WhatsApp. My number is 07506 319 745. If you've got any questions, thoughts, I'm sure at some point Sid will give you ways of contacting him. Um, and without further ado, that's it. Hi, Sid. How you doing?
I know. Nice. Thank you. Nice to meet you, and thank you for
I
your
love
time.
that shirt.
My bird shirt.
Your bird shirt. Is it what birds are they?
I don't know.
I was trying to figure it
Some
out.
kind of finch, I think.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
thinking like sort of Robin-ish, but without the red.
Yeah, I
Very
think
nice.
so.
Very
Yeah.
nice. Is that your spring shirt?
Yes, I've been a big fan of Ted Baker's shirts for many years, ever since he started, or ever since they started.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just like the shirts. So
I've
yes.
just discovered a brilliant brand of underwear and socks. I'm very sporty, so I get through these things very quickly. They're a French brand called Stans, but
Oh, okay.
great. Absolutely. I can't recommend them enough. So
Make a note.
yeah, so I use them for all my running and my kickboxing, which is where I was just before this, and really fun stuff. Lots of colors and very vibrant.
Oh, brilliant.
Really good fun. I was saying to you just before the show, I asked you the obvious question because your press release was about youth work and working with young people. And I said, "Are you a youth worker?" And you said no. So tell us about you. You're in Wales at the moment. Is that where you were born and grew up? And
No, I was born in Portsmouth. My dad was in the Navy, so
okay,
born in Portsmouth.
did you move
Moved-
around a lot then as well?
Yeah, so lived in Scotland, Wales, Dartmouth, Cornwall, Belgium, Cyprus, and on it went. And then when
Interesting
I,
lifestyle for a kid because I've spoken to a lot of
yeah,
ex-forces kids. It's that thing of moving around, but also that thing of if you do anything wrong, it's the CO of the organisation pulls your parent in, who then gets hold of you. So there's significant consequences for parents and stuff like that. It's a very structured, or maybe it's slightly over-structured environment. What was it like for you?
I mean, I enjoyed. It was nice, kind of moving around, but then I didn't, because so some holiday, sometimes I go to school and then I'd come back because I went to boarding school at the age of 7. When I'd come back, I'd be in a totally different area, different house. And I used to find that quite hard, having to make friends again, moving on. So that was quite hard. The dad was very strict, didn't enjoy that. Mum was just, was mum, bless her,
Yeah.
and just kind of went along with it all.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, the thing that I miss, I think most was growing up in one place and kind of going, oh, I went to school there. And, I've got 3 young children now, 8, 6, and 5. And what I love is that they go to the same primary school that their granddad went to, you know, 60, 70 years ago. I
Yeah.
love that. And the fact that it's still the same school, it's got the same herringbone kind of wooden floor. And I love that. And I would have loved to have had that.
Yeah.
So I hope that with my kids, even though I'm of latter years, I hope that they will have that continuity of the same place, same school friends.
A lovely thing
So
to do.
yeah, that's the thing I missed.
Yeah, I mean, the schools I went to, I because I had three older sisters and a younger brother, so they were there in front of me. So, like, we had that sort of tradition of the
Mm,
family being there, and so my sisters' names were known, and that was really nice, actually.
mm. Yeah,
Kept the bullies off my back as well.
typically. Yeah, I miss that. Yeah, I miss those kind of foundation really. Yeah, grounding really, I think.
Yeah. And what did
Um,
your dad do in the forces? What was his?
so I mean, he did quite a good story really because he started off as a sailor. So he went to a fairly well-known school and didn't get a single qualification at all, and then left. And his dad, who was a bank manager for NatWest, basically said to him, "You've ruined your career, or you've ruined your education. You're not going to amount to anything." He tried a bit of work in the bank that didn't work out, and then joined the Royal Navy as a sailor, literally entry level,
Yeah.
and then eventually worked up to becoming a commander, which was pretty amazing, really, in the 35.
Commando.
Yeah, commander.
That's
Yeah,
commander, not commando.
no, one down from captain. So he literally took all his officers' exams and
Wow,
passed them
that's
all.
really
Yeah,
impressive. Something trying, but they're a particular type of person who can be quite uncompromising. Who can
yeah,
take
yeah.
it
I
that
mean,
high, I think.
yeah, definitely. Yeah. So no, he did really well. And he was an observer, so he flew in the Gannets and the Buccaneers off Art Royal and
Wow.
Hermes and all the kind of, he was number two in charge of HMS Devonshire. I was christened on board HMS Lynx. So it's a really interesting kind of,
You enjoy that environment, that military environment. It can be quite fun, but it also can be quite oppressive.
not really. I mean, it wasn't, no, I didn't, did I enjoy it? I kind of enjoyed some of the kind of the trimmings, the kind of the memorabilia, all of the plaques that he had in the house, for all the ships that he was part of and various ceremonial swords, which I still got. Yeah, but I didn't enjoy the military side to it. It was all very cold, very hard. There was no emotion. My mum was much more emotional, but she was never allowed to express her emotions, and I think for me, it was around that whole kind of emotional intelligence, that whole self-awareness of emotion
Yeah,
was completely
wasn't
numbed,
it?
was was wasn't there at all. So I really struggled, certainly in my teenage years and my 20s.
What was the school like? It was there can be issues around sort of boarding. I guess it gave you some sense of stability if you were at the same school.
Yeah, I mean, I was bullied a bit really when I first started because I was 7 years old, possibly the smallest child in the school. Um, I found it really weird. It was just really odd.
Yeah,
Used to cry a lot, all that kind of stuff wasn't particularly nice. And then as I got older, you work with the system, don't you? You do
yeah,
what you do, and when you get to sort of 16, 17, 18. You're much more kind of, I was much more outgoing. Used to love sport, as you do, and that was my kind of vehicle to kind of get through. Wasn't great academic, like coloring in and painting and doing stuff, drawing. Yeah, so that was all right. Yeah, and then went to college, well, went to Polytechnic to do graphic design.
yeah.
But I also, it was interesting actually. I also had two places at university to do psychology, and I was always so fascinated by psychology, but also really loved the kind of the graphics, the kind of the advertising side.
Yeah.
And that's eventually, when I left college, I went to London and spent 24 years, branding, marketing, and kind of coloring in for money, really.
And were you even at that point aware that there was a lack of emotional intelligence in your life, or were you just one of those young guys flung into that environment, disabled and not realizing how disabled
I,
you were?
I nicely put, I think I was just disabled and went in there and, did the usual drink and drugs and,
Just
all that
flopped
kind of
around.
stuff. Yeah, because you kind of just
That's right.
go, come on. And then hopefully you think you're going to find your sort of your thing or your answers by doing all of that kind of stuff,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
the whole numbing thing. And you realize that after a while that ain't going to work and it doesn't work. And
Yeah.
then you kind of go, ah, okay, now I need to look inward and need to well, I mean, it was like I said to you earlier, it's like that, you pick your phone up and it's like that. I need to understand my operating system and why it operates and thinks the way that it does, and how might I do something about that.
Right. Okay. But how did you find uni? Was it all right? It was, I mean, it's sort of set up for guys anyway, university mostly.
I loved it.
Just get pissed and have parties
Well,
and
that's it. I mean,
is that
that's
what you
what you
did?
do. And and I was lucky. I was of a time where your local government or your local council paid for the government paid for you to go to college.
Yeah, yeah, I remember those days.
I mean, just
Let's
just
not talk about it too much because we might get hate mail.
I know we will. And I'm just I'm just very lucky. I mean, I had an overdraft. I used to. I mean, basically, in the holidays, I would work. So I'd work on the farms because we lived in Somerset. So I'd either pick Brussels sprouts or, grade potatoes or pack potatoes or do something on the farms, and then go back to college with kind of like a bit of money in the bank. And then I would blow my grant and I would blow all the saved money and then get to the holidays and have to re-earn it.
Yeah,
So I was used to that kind of, feast or famine kind of world.
yeah.
But I loved it. Yeah, I enjoyed it. Met some great people, learned some great stuff. Um, yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? No, you kind of you look back and go, God, I wish I'd done more or thought more, but it is what it
What
is.
do they say? Youth is wasted on the young.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
If I had the same body now with this mind, I'd have a good laugh, I tell you.
Oh, yeah,
I'd
definitely.
enjoy it a lot. Uh,
Yeah,
I just
yeah,
remember my 20s and all that time as I was so full of angst. It's like, no wonder. Like, I'm so glad I'm not there anymore.
yeah.
These days I don't care anymore. That's it. I'm done. I'm done with all that neurosis. But I guess you need it when you're hunting for your family and partner and all that sort of stuff. You have to be sort of on the lookout for sort of the latest trends.
I think so.
I'm
Yeah.
so glad I'm past all of that these days. No,
Yeah, I am. But then I look at my kids and I kind of think, God help you in many ways because, we know what the landscape is
we're
like.
going to get onto that in a minute. I agree with you. I think without getting you anxious or depressed as a parent, but I think it's shit to be a kid at this particular
It's
point in time.
hard. It's really
Really,
hard.
really, what we do to kids is not right, and we need a national conversation about what we've done because it's wrong. It's just wrong. It's
Well,
anti.
we also need a global conversation too, because it's like, there are many countries coming up behind us who are going to do exactly this or are doing the same thing, and you kind of go,
You know what?
no.
You know what? This is maybe getting a bit off topic, but anyway, whatever. The UK does have a particular place in the world where it can influence changes simply because it
Mm,
does stuff.
mm,
And it still is that.
mm.
We may not be empire, but we are able. We sent one chieftain tank to the war in Europe, and everybody else said, "Okay, we'll send tanks now." That's the sort of influence we have,
Yes.
and so I think that's possible. But coming back, so you got through uni, sort of a blur, but you got your qualifications, and you went on to then do branding and design. Is that right?
Yep. Yep. And I did that for 30 odd years, I think. And it was great. I worked at some great companies. I worked for some amazing people, some incredible people.
Yeah,
But it was funny, Noel, I always found and thought there was something missing.
yeah.
It wasn't quite, I mean, I used to get paid at one point a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
But it was never, there wasn't much purpose in it really.
Were you aware of that at the time? Were you struggling emotionally, or were
And
you
that's,
just
yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I think that with a kind of culmination, of the whole emotional intelligence and not really being able to understand myself, had a marriage that had failed, and just going down. I think the same thing, the same repetitive lessons kept coming up
that's
and
the
me not really paying attention and not
that's
really
like,
learning.
hang
Then
on,
it was
that's
kind of like,
this work.
yeah, and it's like, really, 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 and you kind of go, come on.
At what point, what was the large enough sledgehammer to finally crack that nut, do you think? Was there an event or was it
Well, I think in terms of my career, yeah, I remember going in front of a board and, they're basically asking what the numbers for the figures were. And the person I was working with, she talked about all the figures and the profit and all that kind of stuff. And then I said, yeah, well, we've won all these awards and we've got all this amazing stuff. And they went, yeah, all right. And just weren't interested in that. And I kind of thought, but the creative product's the most important thing. And they weren't interested in that. They were just interested in the profit. And then that was it. I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. And I walked away. That was it. And then I kind of just wandered around and bumped into things and just didn't really know what I was doing for quite a while.
Mr. Pinball.
Yeah, it was honestly, very much like a pinball. And then decided to relocate up to North Wales because I had bought a cottage up here because I was divorced and my daughter lived in on the Wirral. And I used to come up for weekends and, stay in the cottages and stuff. And then eventually thought, well, why don't I live there? And it was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, literally, it's a place called Llandarfel, which is outside Bala. I was a mile and a half from another known human being, and it got down to -18 at in the winter time, and I lived there with a dog called Bilbo because Bilbo was one of my heroes when I
You
was
would.
growing up. Yeah, as you would, yeah. And then I thought, why don't I start a branding company up here in North Wales, because that's what you do, right?
Yeah.
And then just went, you're mad, this is just bonkers, and then eventually started doing talks on brand around Wales.
Okay.
And then the Welsh government said, would you be interested going into schools to do a talk on being an entrepreneur and, colouring in for money? And I said, yeah, go on then.
Before you do that, I want to ask you a question
Go on.
because I know this bit of the story and I want to get into it. But how did you know? What made you believe that it was the creative product, that the creativity that was more important than this bottom line stuff?
Good question. Well, for me, one of my heroes has always been Steve Jobs, that whole Think Different campaign, which is, we are the Mavericks, so the kind of the weirdos, the misfits. For me, was a real tell. And when I think of Johnny Ive and what he did with Wozniak and with Jobs and stuff, for me, it's always been around that creativity. It's always been around, and that's the thing that I celebrate with a human being, that immense wealth of knowledge and imagination. And the money side is important, of course, because that's kind of commerce and
To
stuff.
pay your bills? Yeah.
Yeah,
Pay your
absolutely.
bills.
For me, it's all around. I suppose in a way, does it go back to my childhood of wanting that recognition and that love? Maybe that's it for me. Maybe creating something where people kind of go, wow, that's amazing, was that recognition that I wanted,
There's
from, as a
strong
very young.
evidence that creativity and
Mm,
nurturing and growth are the same thing, same
mm,
processes, and
mm,
certainly certain forms of like musical appreciation is a prior in
mm,
utero to language acquisition, etc.,
mm.
etc. So there's strong evidence about that. But I wondered what your insight into it was now. So you saw these mostly men, I presume, in this meeting, just sort of trash this thing, and you were
Yeah,
like,
yeah, not
oh,
interested.
this is
Yeah,
wrong. It's wrong.
yeah,
You went off to go and find yourself by living in the middle of nowhere.
yeah. I did. Yes. Yes. Good point. I did.
The classic sort of bloke experience, isn't it? Can't do this life thing. I'll live in the middle of nowhere with a dog, and that'll sort it all out.
Yeah, it was my cave moment really,
Yeah.
which was massive. I mean, I remember.
Carl Young did it as well. He turned himself completely mad with it.
Oh yeah, and the thing that was interesting was that there were times where I used to get so anxious I wouldn't go out, I wouldn't leave the house.
Yeah, of course, of course.
I mean, there was a whole bunch
What
of
else did
stuff
you think
that
was going to
was.
happen,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Oh, I mean, it was fantastic. I mean, it was everything. It was, it was every breakdown you could possibly imagine over the space of however many years. Because
Yeah.
the thing is, it's that thing, isn't it? No, eventually you have to face you. And it's that mirror moment of, well, who are you and what are you and why are you and
So
and all those.
let's okay now let's bring in the school because looking at that mirror, what's that mirror? I get the mirror. Okay, so you go to this school because you're going to give a talk on branding. What happens?
Well, so basically the Welsh government said, Sid, go into schools and kind of do this kind of entrepreneur branding kind of thing. So I arrived at this school and I had my laptop with an hour's worth of slides talking about Steve Jobs and Ariana Huffington, all these amazing people who created amazing things around the world. And I literally got to slide two. So it was the first slide was Sid Madge name there. And then the second slide was a very simple question, which is if you could use one word to describe yourself, what would it be? Now I've used that question for decades in businesses, ask and thinking about different stakeholder sentiment, all that kind of stuff, perception or whatever. So I had this slide on this screen and the first lad, I said, you're all going to answer this question. They're right, year 10, year 11. So that's 14, 15 years old, about 20, 30 kids. And there was a lad sat here And I said to him, and I was super excited, I said to him, "What's your word?" And he said to me, "Weirdo."
Yeah.
And I just said,
And talk about somebody holding up a mirror, right?
"Yeah." And I just said to him,
Right.
"I love that word."
Yeah, quite.
And he said, "No." He said, "I'm bullied. I don't fit in at school."
Yeah, bang on.
And I was like, "Okay."
What do I do with this?
When I went, well, let's just park that thought. And I went round the rest of the room, and then at least 30 to 40% of them said abnormal, freak, misfit.
Yeah.
And whether it had been guided by what he had said, don't know. But that was the landscape of the words that they used.
Now, the interesting thing for me, and this is a question to think about, you don't have to answer this, but in a sense, they sort of are describing you, but you were very successful. Because if you look
Mm,
back on that abnormal kid who didn't get what he wanted, was in this strange army, sort of armed forces environment that didn't have the EQ, but was in many ways was very successful because that sort of weirdness was all right for a while for blokes to be. It was sort of what was required of us in many ways.
I think, yeah, but I think also, I think, 10 years, because this was 10 years ago, I think also, I think it was just a very good reflection of actually how young people were thinking about themselves then. And I literally, I mean, I, I thought, well, I've got another X
Sorry, I
50
threw you a bit of a curveball there. I was just
a
interested.
little bit. Well, no, no, I mean, but I had, a whole bank of slides for the next 50 minutes. But I thought, well, that's not going to work because that's all about people who've kind of made it and done it.
Yeah,
And I picked my phone up and I just said, this phone, obviously it wasn't this one, is based on an operating system. It's got software. The hardware is this, and it's got software. It tells it what it needs to do based on your instructions. I said, is that the same with a human being? And they went, well, yeah. And I said, so if this code in this phone or this computer or laptop
yeah,
is glitchy, what would happen to, the functionality of you as a human being? And they said, well, it wouldn't work as well. And I said, well, okay, so if we could understand that operating system, what might we be able to do with it? And we started to explore thinking and how we could change that thinking. And then, that was, well, we did some crazy exercises in the 50 minutes, with 45 minutes left. And then at the end, we all agreed we're all freaks and misfits and weirdos, and what a wonderful world it is.
yeah. And using that sense of transforming that experience. I mean, it's quite. I mean, I'm genuinely impressed that you were able to adapt to those young people in that moment.
But I think it's one of those things, Noel, it's that everything happens for a reason. And that was my pivotal moment in my life that said, you've now learnt enough about yourself and the world and branding and whatever to help people like this change their lives. And, that was, as I said, that was 10 years ago. People weren't talking about this stuff then. And if they were, it was very much, under the radar. So from that session, I then did loads of research into self-harm, obesity, pupil referral units, all the stuff that people didn't want to talk about and didn't really understand, and just went, wow, is this really the social landscape that we're living in? And thought, look, Sid, you're a clever guy, you're a creative guy. You've worked with some of the biggest companies in the world to change perceptions and to change thinking through creativity and imagination, all those wonderful things. Surely you could do something to help people not live the mistakes that you've lived and live a more transformative kind of positive life. And that was 10 years ago. And that's exactly what we do.
And why young people? Why do you think you're interested in helping them?
Well, I mean, we now work with all ages. So we work in, prisons with, young adults, old adults, and everything in between. We also work with organizations too. We work with a lot of people who are unemployed. Why was it important for the young people? Because I think for me, when we look at our base of our pyramid as a nation, when you look at I suppose what's sort of fulfilling those bottom segments is preschool, primary school, secondary, further higher. You kind of go, if we don't get this right,
Mhm.
all of this other stuff will just collapse. You know, if you think now there are nearly 1 million kids who are disengaging with secondary education,
Yeah.
it's nuts.
Yeah. When
So
you
for
say a
me,
million kids, are we talking a million boys mostly, or is it across the board?
I mean, it's a higher percentage of boys, but it's certainly, the instance of young girls, abstaining from school or disengaging is increasingly high. And people kind of think, well, it's just kind of kids from, not so good backgrounds. It's not. It's across the board now. I mean, it
Is
really
it?
is. So for me, it was a case of let's look at what we can do in education because it's easy, because you've got people referral units, you've got colleges, schools. And I just started testing some of the material in those environments, really.
So tell me about, so you start with this concept of, having an operating system and then apps, which is a great way to talk to young people, I think, because it's, that's how they're experiencing the world and they're looking at these things. So tell me about how the model evolved to begin to include other people and develop systems which were sort of like I suppose performance coaching type
Mm,
systems. How
mm,
do I better myself?
mm.
Stuff that you've learned from the boardroom, I guess, and
Yeah.
and place them in contexts that they weren't originally designed for, and sort of how you adapted them and how the model grew and what it looks like now, I guess, really, and how I'm interested to know how people think about it as well, sort of because like it's a I've worked in those
Mm.
the C boardroom, that sort of stuff. Is a very different type of person to
Yeah.
a type of person where you're doing this workshop, right? So it's like I to get to that place, you have a lot of these skills already. Sorry, that's I told you that's I'm going to go and collect a parcel. 1 second. That happened last week as well. Twice. So so you've got a very different culture where these tools were developed. You're coming into this culture, sort of how have you adapted and developed these tools and understanding to sort of support people to get into that type of experience of being excellent versions of themselves?
Yeah, I think I almost sort of go back to kind of, is it Socrates that said, know thyself? And many of the great kind of maxims really, which is all around, we mentioned it earlier about emotional intelligence, isn't it? And when you look at I mean, a few years ago, I went to Henley Business School and did a coaching qualification. And the reason why I did it was because I'd spent 5 years developing tools in lots of different areas. And I thought, okay, Sid, how could you test if they are robust enough to go into the corporate setting? So I kind of thought Henley, a friend of mine had been on the course. I thought, let's just go to Henley and did a, diploma, whatever it is, or whatever qualification it is in coaching. And I tested all of this stuff and I learned, the stuff, Gestalt, whatever it is, whatever kind of, framework that they teach from. And I went, you know what, what we do is as good, if not better, than the stuff that I'm learning. And I thought, you know what, we're absolutely onto something
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
And, it is that thing. It is around self-awareness, self-regulation, emotion, around empathy, compassion, social skills, motivation, all the stuff that we talk about going back thousands of years. And Viktor Frankl talks about, man's search for meaning, that sense of purpose, that sense of identity, what we now call agency, for me was all the stuff that I used to do in the corporate world. So agency for me, that sense of who I am and why I am, was really relevant to a teenager or somebody in preschool to somebody who is, sitting on a board or as a CEO of whatever organization. It's the same stuff.
It may surprise people to understand that high functioning individuals in the corporate level are talking in this way because they are. And I've been in those
Yeah,
meetings and people do. They talk about meaning and purpose,
yeah.
and they talk in these quite esoteric ways about how they're running their company, as well as the bottom line stuff that you always
Mm.
get. But it might be surprising to people that those types of conversations are happening. And it might be surprising to people that they're useful conversations
Oh,
to.
huge. Oh yeah, and also that when you look at the C-suite, you look at the executive, whatever it is, in whatever organization, they have got the children which are exhibiting some of the behaviors
Exactly.
that we see in universities, in colleges, in schools, in pros. So it cascades down. I mean, that's what happens. The apple never falls too far from the tree. And if everything was hunky dory, we wouldn't see a million kids being excluded or excluding themselves from education. We wouldn't see that.
Yeah.
But we are seeing it. We're seeing it more so since COVID, we know. So there's something that isn't quite right. And for me, it is around, and having grown up in an emotionally stunted environment as a family, I know all too well where that goes to. And there's a great guy called Dr. Gabor Mate. Love his work. He's got a new book out last couple of years, The Myth of Normal. And he says the opposite of addiction is connection. So when you think of that as a metaphor, call it whatever you want, if we feel connected to self, to everything else, we don't need to look externally, drugs, drink, self-harm, whatever that is, because we feel complete. If we don't feel complete, we look externally for all of those things. And having gone through that, I was a self-harmer as a child, all that kind of stuff as a teenager. I know why I did what I did, and I know the process that I went through, but I also know the stuff that cured me, in other words, that helped me get that sense of agency, that sense of belonging, so that I didn't have to do those things anymore.
Yeah. And when did you sort of, because you've now got like a stable relationship and kids, and you're a dad, as well as all the other stuff that you're doing in your spare time, like saving loads of kids, sort of all that stuff. Um, what happened to get you to that point where you began to have, successful relationships? What was this sort of secret for you?
Well, here's the oxymoron in a way. I mean, I have so Lily, who is, 25, 26, 27. She, so she's the eldest. I've now got an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 5-year-old. Now, when I got divorced originally from Lily's mum, I didn't want any more children. I went through a series of relationships. I ended up with somebody who got pregnant. It happens. And I kind of went, shit, what do I now do? I don't think I can cope with another child. So literally within 18 months, so within 18 months, another child was born and then another child. And I just went, shit. And then my dad had died.
How is this happening?
Oh yeah, oh honestly, it was, I mean, talk about the perfect storms. And then my dad had died. I also contracted pneumonia. I very nearly died out of that. So there was a whole bunch of stuff that was happening at the same time that I just couldn't cope with. Also, when my youngest was born, within 2 weeks we went into lockdown, and then I got a letter from my ex-partner now, basically saying she had moved back to her mum and dad's in a small holding, and you've got to leave my house, and that's it. So that was it. So I literally ended up with 3 children, very young children, having to find somewhere new to live, and then having to then build a life with them as a single dad. So no, in terms of like the model relationship, that never happened. And the fact that I've also been on my own for the last 5.5 years because my focus is my children and my business. That's it.
Those
So
are successful relationships, right?
oh, huge. Oh yeah,
If you
absolutely.
look at the way you were brought up and the way you're bringing up your children,
Oh,
very different,
just
right?
I mean, just completely different
The
in every way.
relationship I was thinking of that was most successful. I wasn't really thinking of a romantic partner.
Sorry. Okay.
No, no, it's fine. It's cool. I didn't make it clear enough. I was thinking about your daughter, to be honest, because you went to go and live by her, didn't you?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, 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 yeah.
And
And I
that's
think
where it
for
all
me,
started for you. If you hadn't done that, you wouldn't be where you are today.
no,
There
no,
was
and
some sense in which that was the relationship that kept you sort of grounded to what is important.
yeah, and I think that sense of, I mean, I never had a conversation with my father about anything other than it was absolutely functional or technical. Nothing. I mean, no emotional. I mean, I remember he used to play golf, and I eventually learned to play golf. And I remember one Christmas I bought him a book by, is it Bob Rotello? Golf in the Mind or The Art of Putting or whatever it was. And he unwrapped it and he literally just threw it back at me, said, I don't need stuff like that.
Sorry, it's not
No, no,
funny.
no, no, no,
It's
no, no, it
horrific.
was. I
I'm
mean,
sort
at
of
the
like,
time I was heartbroken. I was
yeah,
like, whoa. But I never had a conversation with him about anything to do with any form and structure of emotion. None. I mean, when we used to play golf, I remember once I was playing in the Vale of Llangollen, beautiful course, and I think we were on, I think the ninth hole, and I was three up or whatever it was, and I hit the most fantastic shot straight onto the green. He said, "Right, I'm going." And he walked off. I said, "Where are you going?" He said, I'm just going." And he stood by my car because I'd driven. I said to him, "Take the keys." No, he said. He stood by my car. I finished the whole round because I teamed up with somebody else. And he just stood by the car. And I was like, what? So, I mean, my life in terms of my relationship with my dad was rubbish. And I didn't want that for my children.
yeah.
And
Why
I
not?
still don't.
Why not? Why do you think you were different?
Because I just ended up being so screwed up in so many ways. And self-medicating with drugs and drink and sex and, all that kind of stuff
Yeah.
because you're trying to fill those gaps, those voids, aren't you? I
Now,
mean,
would you say, putting aside that obviously you're a great dad, you have good relationships, like in the other sense of success, the traditional sense of success, would you say you're successful?
no, no, because I haven't. I mean, we've a great saying at me, which is, do good by doing well, and we are doing well, but we're not doing as much good as I want to do. So for me, however many thousand people have been through our programs, I want it to be in the millions and in the billions. I do. I really do. I want all of our stuff to be translated into multiple languages because there is a better way of.
You will. I have no doubt you will. And I'm going to push that question again because there's the point I'm making. Maybe I should just make the
Yeah,
point
make the point.
rather than ask you questions because um, you're an interesting person to talk to, very interesting to talk to. As a human being, you're very thoughtful, you're very connected, as well as being somebody who's very focused and on your goals and what you want to achieve. So, I'm positing this thing about what it is to be a successful guy, if you like, or a successful human being. But let's stick with guys because there's two guys talking to each other and we're talking about men, fathers and their kids and all that sort of stuff. And our experience, my experience of being fathered, my birth father was a nutter, like dangerous, violent alcoholic. My
Wow.
stepfather was lovely. Do you know what I mean? He
Wow.
was great. And when he said about Brussels sprouts, I remember my stepfather Alf, he taught me to grow vegetables because he was from that generation where you grew your own vegetables. And I remember him growing some sprouts and being totally shocked what they look like in the wild. It's like those long stalks with sprouts on them. So, but it's that thing of given the early childhood I had, the idea of success as a man was very specific.
Yeah.
You're a provider, you make enough money to provide, and all that sort of stuff. Um, it seems to me you do that you are successful in that sense. You've been successful at to the level of that traditional male thing of being, a senior person in
Mm.
organizations. You now have your own organization, which is very successful. I know you're going to go, yeah, but I want it to be more than that because that's the way you are. That's sort of like I think I'm getting a hang on you now. Um, and so in my sense, you have demonstrated again and again and again that you are successful on every single level. Um, but at the same time, and this might surprise people, it's really important to you, your state of well-being and health, your psychological health, your relational health,
Yeah.
where your kids are at, your sense of nurturing in the world is quite clear. And it may surprise people that a successful serial entrepreneur like you would be interested in that stuff. And I say make surprise people because we've got these successful serial entrepreneurs on the news who are devastatingly horrific,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And they are blokes who are
Mm.
devastatingly horrific. to the
Mm,
point where they are triggering responses in people.
mm.
Yeah, you're a very different animal, and I'm intrigued by that. I'm genuinely intrigued by that.
Okay.
Okay. As to what's that about? How did you manage to get from a highly dysfunctional childhood, which it was? There's for people who don't know, there's whole books written about boarding school syndrome,
Syndrome, yeah.
as you've probably read them.
Yeah.
There's whole books about kids of parents who are in the armed forces. There's loads, tons of research about how devastating that is. But here you are, you know, and I'm really intrigued. I'm really intrigued by that. What would you say? There's a like clearly one thing is the love you have for your daughter.
Mm.
Then the creativity, I guess, is another through line.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, where does it come from? I think one, I mean, we touched on it earlier about that recognition. Yeah, I mean, years ago when I went into therapy and stuff, and
Ah, you went into therapy as well.
yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, one does, doesn't one? And it
Keep
was
throwing
really
these things
interesting,
into
actually.
conversation
Well,
like it's
well,
like
no, it's quite interesting, Noel, because it's like,
it is interesting.
so my real name is not Sid,
Right.
it's Nigel.
Okay.
So I was christened Nigel Madge, and I hated that name.
Yeah.
I used to get a lot of, ridicule at school, all that kind of stuff. Nigel, bit thick, all that kind of stuff.
We're only making plans for Nigel.
Which is just a brilliant song. Love that one, the old XTC.
That just must have horrified you, though. That
Yes, yeah,
you
a
would
little
have
bit.
been really battered by that song.
And then when I was a teenager, I mean, I was a teen when, the Sex Pistols started and all that kind of stuff and whatever. So when I kind of got to when we lived in Cyprus, I shaved all my hair and just was a bit crazy.
Yeah.
And the friends that I was hanging out with,
You've got hair these days, but you're still a bit crazy, you know.
just still a bit crazy. They basically said, "You don't look like Nigel. You look like that Sid Vicious."
And I was wondering if that was going to be the story.
And I went, and they said, "We're going to call you Sid." And do you know what? It was so funny because when I went into counselling, Tony, who was the counsellor at the time in North London, he said to me, if you could go back and visit Nigel, what would you say?
Oh,
And I
right.
just cried.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
sobbed. And
absolutely.
I realized that what I'd done was to create this alter ego, this new persona of Sid who's tough and, a bit of a hooligan to survive
Yeah,
and to look after this little boy, Nigel.
yeah,
And I can still picture now Nigel sitting on a bench alone and me going up and putting my arm around him and saying, it'll be fine, it'll be okay.
right. And you made that come true.
I have absolutely right.
Really made it come true.
Yeah,
And you're
absolutely.
continuing to make it come true. Now, which is interesting to me. And I think, and I don't know what you think about this, but I think it's really important that we have these models of humans and models of men now, particularly right now, who have come from
Mm,
you come from real difficulty.
mm,
But I know how
mm,
complicated that childhood is. I didn't want to go into too much, but
mm,
I know the research, so I know the outcomes.
mm,
Talk about high aces, and yet you've transformed your life. You've been trying to do that. It seems to me
mm,
all your life
mm,
in some way,
mm,
but you suddenly found the trick is to start helping other people.
mm. Yeah.
And that has changed it for you.
Yeah, and I think for me, when that young lad said weirdo, I complete and when he talked about being bullied, not fitting in, his music was weird, and the other kids what they talked about, it hit home because I had lived and was living that life, and I went, we can do something about this. We don't need to live in that, in that world. And I think, and even now, you know, I gravitate to the kids in my kids' school who I know the kids, their parents are in prison or they're being neglected or something's happening. They naturally gravitate. I mean, it's people often say, Sid, when you go into a room full of kids, it's like watching the Pied Piper.
Yeah,
They naturally gravitate towards me. I have no idea why, but they just do. And I think it's because I've lived that pain. I know what it's like, and
You
I
clearly
and
do.
I'm
Yeah.
still that child. I'm
Yeah.
still that wonderful creative child.
So we're getting towards the end of the show, and I want to come to the press release itself because that's quite important.
Mm.
The work that you've been doing in the, what we call the secure sector or the criminal justice world. So you went to Feltham last year, and you've been
I
again
did.
this year,
Yeah.
and you're looking at work with youth workers who are working with young people at risk and who are in the system or close to being in the system. So tell me a bit about that and how's that's all come about.
Well, Felton came about because of the work we've been doing with Berwyn and with Stoke Heath and a few other prisons. And somebody said, "Have you been to Feltham?" And I said, "No." And they said, "You should go." So I visited it last year, met some of the brilliant people that work there. Just, I mean, honestly, no. I mean, talk about they should get OBEs, MBEs,
Yeah, yeah.
knighthoods. These are the people that work
No
in the prison.
argument
You
here.
know them.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I went to the prison and I said, "Yeah, we've got this program, Counting on Confidence, all to do with numeracy and literacy, but in a really crazy, creative way. Let me come in and do some sessions." So, literally, a couple of weeks ago, I went down to Feltham and met, I don't know, 18, 20 young people, got them through some of the course and other bits and pieces, and just went, I feel at home here in terms of helping. And there was one young lad there, 16 years old. He's in for murder. He's, 20 years. But when you speak to him and you read the stuff in the papers, you go, "I'll lock him up forever." But when you listen to him and you listen to his story and how he got to that and his journey, there by the grace of God go any of us. And you just go, "I get it." His life, all his life was gangs, guns, knives. That's how he lived. That's how he survived.
Yeah.
And he said to me, "Sid, how else was I meant to survive? What else was I meant to do?"
Yeah.
And if we aren't giving them an alternative in some shape or form, then we are failing them. That is our fault
Yeah.
as adults, as taxpayers, whatever we call ourselves. It's down to us and down to all of us to do something about it.
Totally agree. And it's also there's another lesson there, I think, which needs to be learned is that we can try if we like to wash our hands of the struggles that our young people are going through. At some point, though, they end up in Feltham if we're not careful. And so we're dealing with them whether we like it or not. And
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
most costly in every
Yeah.
single metric. That's the most costly way of dealing with it. And it seems to me that people like yourself, who have maybe something to suggest about how we intervene
Mm,
prior to that,
mm, mm.
is useful to listen to.
And,
Um,
and and also, Noel, it's like, as I mentioned to the people who are at the C-suite and the executives, it's those kids who are going to universities. Look at suicide and self-harm rate in universities
yeah,
through the roof, right? So it's not just the kids who are in Feltham, it's the kids who are going to college and university, who are self-harming, who are, doing whatever they're doing. Those are all of our children.
yeah.
It's not just isolated to go, "Yeah, but they live in such and such." It isn't, it's everywhere. And as you say, it is our responsibility as adults, as human beings, to do whatever we can. Because if we don't, it ain't going to get any better.
But it's also, and this is again something to think about, but it seems to me that one of the things that's transformed you as a person is recognizing that you have to nurture some people who have needs. Your daughter was the first one, I guess,
Mm,
and your other kids, and then seeing these other kids when you met them. That seems to me to have been a transformation in your life
mm, mm.
and has given you a huge amount. And I think that that is also a really important message to get out to people. And there's research evidence for that. Helping others who need help helped me.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no, we always say to people, people say, "Why is it called me?" Well, it's about the magic in everyone, every day, everywhere, right? That's it. And we help people find, live, and give their magic, right? You cannot live unless you find it. You cannot give unless you live it. And the thing is that, with Maslow, that wonderful pyramid, although we never created a pyramid, when you look at the very base level, that's I find who I am, find myself, live, and then give. Only until we go through those stages can we truly give and be philanthropic and become, the human who or the human beings that we are. And that for me is why it's so important to do what we do. And as you say, I found myself or I found others by finding myself. And that's what I do. I find and live and give that magic every day as however I do it or we
Yeah.
do it.
And honor yourself in the process, right? which is great. Great stuff. I remember Mr. Kewick was a teacher of mine in secondary school. He
What a
was,
great name.
yeah, he was great, but he was the one that was really good with chalk. If you were talking like
Or the
that.
board rubber.
Yeah, yeah. He was good with that one as well, but
Yeah.
he managed to get over that habit. But one thing he always said that I'd never forgotten, and he meant this with a passion, was he said, when you're disrespecting me, you're not. You're disrespecting yourself, and you got to
Wow.
learn to respect yourself.
Wow.
Do you know what I mean? It's like
Wow.
it was amazing. It was like that. It stayed with me forever. And learning to respect ourselves, to learn to have a bit of self-esteem, it seems to me that that's what you give to the people that you're working with.
Yeah.
And it
Absolutely.
goes a long way, that stuff, right?
That's huge. It's everything. You
Yeah,
know, and it's like when people say, well, they just join gangs. Well, that those gangs give them that sense of identity, that sense of belonging, that esteem,
yeah.
which they haven't had. So when you look at role models, they don't have role models. So they look to their brothers and their friends who are in the gangs because they want that sense of connection.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Esteem, call it what you want.
So we're going to leave it there because we've run out of time. How do people get hold of you, your organization?
Me with three E's dot global. That's us.
Yeah. And you're available. You've got loads of people available to do training and courses and the whole shebang.
Yeah. So if organizations want to run this, we have our training programs, which we train magic makers to then go and deliver it in schools, colleges, universities, wherever they want it to deliver, and in organizations too. Absolutely.
Great. That classic sort of entrepreneur spirit. Yeah, we'll do it.
Of course, get it done.
Absolutely. Great. Real pleasure to see you this morning. Thank you. You stay there. Folks, I hope you sort of understand now one of the reasons why when I looked at the email about the press release about Sid, I just thought we need to understand that people are working on the solution, people like Sid and other people, rather than, what the news tells us is there's just
Yeah.
a problem.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Do you know
Thank
what
you,
I mean?
Noel.
It's really is important.
Mm.
Lovely to meet you. And don't give me your address, otherwise I will pop in on my way up to Snowdon. You stay there, mate. I hope you've all enjoyed that. Do send messages 07506 319 745 or get hold of
Global.
me.global. Lots of love to you all. Bye bye for now.
Bless you.